Welcome, everybody, to ULT San Diego for the Aquarian series. The title of our presentation today is Trusteeship, and that is going to be given to us by Maurice Bichef. So, as usual, before we begin a reading, this is from the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 9. I accept and enjoy the offerings of the humble soul who in his worship with a pure heart offereth a leaf, a flower, or fruit, or water unto me. Whatever thou doest, O son of Kunti, whatever thou eatest, whatever thou sacrificest, whatever thou givest, whatever mortification thou performest, commit each unto me. Thus thou shalt be delivered from the good and evil experiences which are the bonds of action. And thy heart being joined to renunciation and to the practice of action, thou shalt come to me. I am the same to all creatures. I know not hatred nor favor, but those who serve me with love dwell in me, and I in them. We give you our very own Maurice Bichef.
Well, thank you, and welcome everyone to ULT San Diego. And our theme for this evening is trusteeship, and in particular, being it was Gandhi's birthday, and the fact Gandhi wrote so much about this subject, we're going to pretty much confine our remarks to the idea of Gandhian trusteeship and how he used it in theory and practice, but with a note suggesting that, of course, it wasn't just an idea of Gandhi's, but as the quotes for the week and our other studies have shown, you can find many of the ideas of trusteeship in many of the both ancient and even modern traditions. But we'll confine our remarks to Gandhian trusteeship in theory and practice. And there is a pamphlet available at Concord Grove Press in Santa Barbara, which, if you could see it, is entitled Gandhian Trusteeship in Theory and Practice. And it's just so wonderful and so practical and so useful to disseminate to others. Because in a sense, as you know, you can't really look at Gandhian thought just on the basis of secular dimensions, but rather, in fact, Gandhi, being such a fine direct student of HPB, actually is a messenger from heaven to earth. That is, to understand Gandhi, one has to understand that we have to come from above, below, from the spirit into the secular realm, and also back up and return as well through prayer, will prayer and meditation, self-correction. But nonetheless, I'll start with the notion of the definition here of Gandhian trusteeship, the quote from Hermes. For an individual to be a trustee in any meaningful sense implies that he is acutely aware of the unmet needs of others and simultaneously is capable of controlling and transmuting his own appropriating tendencies. So this notion then that trusteeship is something that can be consciously pursued as a basis of principle, as a basis of one's life, a principle of living, not just as a tactic to achieve something, is very, very important. And for Gandhi, as I mentioned before, it really always starts in the spiritual with a universal principle. And so I will quote from this pamphlet, the first paragraph. Mahatma Gandhi held that all human beings are implicitly responsible to God, the family of man, and to themselves for their use and treatment of all goods, gifts, and talents which fall within their domain. This is so because nature and man are alike upheld, suffused, and regenerated by the divine. There is a luminous spark of divine intelligence in the motion of the atom and in the eyes of every man and woman on earth. We incarnate our divinity when we deliberately and joyously nurture our abilities and assets for the sake of the larger good. In this sense, the finest exemplars of trusteeship are those who treat all possessions as though they were sacred or deeply precious beyond any worldly scale of valuation. Thus, it is only through daily moral choice and the meritorious use of resources that we sustain our inherited or acquired entitlements. And then he goes on, which we'll mention later. For this reason, the very idea of ownership is misleading and is at root a form of violence, because we have this fundamental unity and interdependence such that whatever our past karma has given us both gifts and limitations, but has given us situations where we can uplift everyone, ourself and the whole. And we can do this through holding our precious assets, including our vestures, I might add, in trust, not thinking we own them like it's our selfish, protective prerogative or self-centered prerogative, but in fact, just the opposite. Hold them in trust for the greater good. Now, Gandhi asks us then to become conscious trustees, but in fact, this is nothing unnatural to us. It seems as if we are all natural trustees in the same way that a mother or parents are trustees of a child, or at the opposite end, so to speak, we might become designated even formal statutory trustees of someone who needs help toward the end of their life, settling affairs, but at the same time, acting for the good of that person. So if you were a trustee for another person, even when it came to life or death decisions, you're acting not for yourself, but you're acting for the greater good in the situation. Now, this is not mechanical, or this doesn't mean that there's one approach to take. But in fact, if we can become better trustees, if we can hold to a mental posture that we don't own, it's not ours to keep, so to speak, because as you know, we don't really keep anything on the terrestrial plane. But we keep the spirit and an attitude which can uplift others. And as we've learned in previous ULT meetings, we need to work to consciously sacrifice sometimes for the common good. And we kind of have to balance ourselves as a trustee. On one hand, we have to let go and renounce our unnatural claims with our exaggerated wants and continue as a way of life, not as just a one-off instance to discern our true needs. But at the same time, we're being asked to do this for the sake of the common good, for the sake of helping others. So this is something that many times we're called upon to do in very natural ways. So we shouldn't consider this something exotic so much as, in fact, maybe a pathway of thinking as well as acting, especially in these times where everything is so unnatural, is so unjust, and is so unbalanced. If in fact we're really trustees for the sake of the divine, then when we approach the manifest plane of the earth, the terrestrial plane, the Gandhian trustee pamphlet suggests that there might be 4 different levels of trusteeship. The first one is a societal one. We are all societal actors, and we all certainly have different assets to give. And on certain scales of valuation, you could say a lot or less, or in certain situations. But nonetheless, we all have something to offer. And so we really should be regenerating and refreshing our attitudes, even at the societal level. And Gandhi makes this clear when he writes in one of his letters, The Golden Key, relating to socialism of my conception, when he says, the act of renunciation of everything is not merely physical renunciation, but represents a second or new birth. It is a deliberate act, not done in ignorance. It is therefore a regeneration. So by thinking of trusteeship, certainly renunciation, letting go of that which we do not need or do not need anymore, but not just renunciating it, but in the process, seeing how this renunciation can aid the greater good. One way that this comes up societally is the question of how society allocates resources to people. How can you continuously distribute wealth in a way that the government wouldn't have to do it or be asked to do it and then get resistance for doing it in a mechanical way? How can at least this be done somewhat, at least, at the micro level in communities? And so it becomes the obligation, and HPB, I believe, points this out in the last third of the Key to Theosophy. And Gandhi, of course, in my opinion, is one of her greatest students. As you all know, the young Mohandas Gandhi met HPB in London at the London Lodge. That there is an obligation of the rich to be able to give more of that resource to help uplift and upgrade the poor. There are many different ways of doing this, so it's nothing mechanical and certainly shouldn't be forced as a guilt kind of thing. But the whole idea of trusteeship in this mode came about partly because Gandhi received letters from both capitalists and socialists. And while he was sympathetic to a lot of the abstract principles of socialism, he was very skeptical of how any kind of state or rule-based mechanical implementation of socialism would work. And he was very skeptical of that. But rather, he saw trusteeship as something that is a thoughtful enterprise that takes into account past karmas, takes into account current situations, takes into account dynamic constraints and conditions. but at the same time is a basis of creative imagination. We have, in my opinion, one of the greatest examples of the act of trusteeship in Gandhi's successor, spiritual successor at least, Vinoba Bhave in India. And many of you may already know this, but in 1951, there are a lot of landless peasants, a lot of poverty, a lot of starvation. At the same time, there were communists, the hammer and sickle kind of communists, which you could see today in India as well in a couple of states, who really wanted revolution from below. The masses and the proletariat should take over, et cetera, et cetera. And Vinoba Bhave, who was Gandhi's spiritual successor, and wasn't one prone to a lot of physical action. He was very spiritual. He would say, lesser, lesser, do lesser, lesser. But nonetheless, he felt he had to act. And so he created the Bhudhan movement. And one of the ways then of one example of trusteeship was he went to different large landowners, Mr. Reddy being the first, I think, in India, and he asked, would you allow me to become a member of your family? Can I be your fifth uncle or fifth brother or sister? And if I could, would you be willing to gift some of the acres of land you have to your poorest persons that are working the land? Because they're in really bad shape and they are suffering. And so on behalf of the spiritual, of which I also can represent, that you can make a tremendous act and save India from a lot of potential violent revolution. And starting with Mr. Reddy, in the early 1950s, Vinoba Bhave walked throughout India, and 2 million acres of land were gifted to the lowliest of the low. True, they weren't prime acreage. Nonetheless, they were gifted to sustain and uplift the poor. And this, called the Bhudhan movement, is really an example of distributing wealth. And by creating trust, creating community, creating brotherhood, without any mechanistic idea of equality being similarity or anything like that, but rather simply including everyone, you might say, in a larger circle of love and sustenance. So there may be in micro communities, just people who know each other, and this goes on all the time actually, but we don't hear about it in the newspaper. People who set up a business, train others, maybe immigrants, to set up their business or to take over the business. When something happens that people need resources, they give. And you have this whole informal community of economy, an economy that's much more inclusive. And all of this then, just think if everyone did this, but did this because they were consciously doing it, but at the same time, thoughtfully and intelligently, you would at least reduce the amount of fear, competition, and money grubbing and utter destitute in society. Now, that doesn't mean that the state might not have bounced out. I'm sorry. It doesn't mean that you might not have the cooperation of the state or the government, doing certain things, providing certain minimums to people. But it does mean that there's a lot that can be done, both at the level of thought and at the level of action, to really be a trustee of the human family beyond our own family's inheritance, so to speak. So while there is the societal implementation, the other thing, the other aspects is that we have to look at trusteeship psychologically as well. And when we look at things in psychologically, what trusteeship allows us to do is to have courage detached from violence and creativity dislodged from self-protected formulations of people. So we can develop a psychology not of fear, but abundance. But this kind of abundance is not necessarily on a material valuation. It's an abundance of new notions of noetic activity, where we invoke the eros of fellowship. But this does take a lot of discipline, noetic discipline, as of last week, to be able to really become acutely aware of unmet needs and transmuting our own appropriating tendencies. Because there is a tendency, if we're still oriented toward looking for something for ourselves from the outside, some external support or external status or external reward, even if it's congratulations, so to speak, that we can get, it can sort of blind us from being acutely aware and responding appropriately to unmet needs of others. So the object of conscious trusteeship then is to become more self-aware of our own tendencies for appropriation. And in doing so, we'll then have more energy and outlook, especially if we can have a mental posture through our higher self and through self-correction of seeing the unmet needs of others and how, both individually or through a collectivity, one could really be able to help. Now, the third dimension that's mentioned is, well, how do you put this into practice? And there are a lot of people who suggest that with, other than an ad hoc act of charity, that this isn't really going to catch on, it's not really going to work, it's just an ideal. But the one thing that trusteeship allows us to do is not only to think about how we could be more equitable without being mechanically equal, but in addition to that, we can meditate on the unborn, on future generations. And of course, we know many indigenous societies treat the land, its resources, and their own peoples with a sense of how this is going to be the common good for 5 generations out. So the notion of sustainability, the notion of trusteeship is there. And again, we can use this to kind of uplift the whole if we allow for unknown potentialities of common resources and common good. In other words, we don't know which baby is going to be a genius. So we can support all babies with a minimal standard of guaranteed income, for example, which is what Thomas Paine and others, Martin Luther King, have proposed. And at the same time, we can begin to uplift the whole as well. And people say we can't do anything. Well, we know that there are statutory trusts in the United States. There are statutory trusts to preserve beautiful natural land and even agriculture, so it doesn't get polluted. And the one strategy less talked about, seemingly, is there are a lot when we say market, then we say real estate market, but there are more than one markets. And in order for the rich not to buy up and work on a speculative real estate market, one in a neighborhood can purchase lots, purchase houses, and have both ownership as well as rental, 99-year rentals, all on the basis of statutory trusts, which are legal. All of this, of course, does come back to the point, again, that HPB mentions, and that is necessary, and that is that everyone needs to come together, but those that have more resources for certain things, like buying expensive property these days, need to come forward and go beyond just their family inheritance. There's nothing wrong with the family inheritance, of course, but need to go beyond it to see the greater good, to sustain their neighbors and their neighborhood and the land and the forests and our natural resources. So Gandhian trusteeship, as you could see, is so many multiple levels and is really just, once one begins to think about this, one can put into practice by degrees. And if one doesn't have a lot of money or can't do the kind of things like I just mentioned, then one might just help another person beyond one's family. One might just draw a larger circle and go beyond just those people that we know, but as they say, reach out and connect. But it's something everyone could put into practice by degrees. So it's a very important psychological and a very important dimension. Um, Finally, when we look at trusteeship, we're really talking about cultivating an inner discipline and an inner posture, which is more self-governing and morally sensitive. And so we do need to really attain a more inward moral balance as a trustee. So rather than look at grandiose gestures, which of course could lead to creeping egotism, although egotism is not bad, because if you don't have a strong ego, you won't be able to do very much. So it's just getting back to the notion of renunciation and not being on the fruits of action. But in do this, we can take unconditional vows, as we know, and we can begin to, in our lifestyle, simplify our wants and really identify our own needs and those of others. And in doing so, it does again get back to a bit of motive and a bit of understanding and knowledge. Certainly, ambition seems to always be critical. With no ambition, no one's going to do anything. But at the same time, it has to be kind of a purified ambition, a more sattvic ambition, so to speak, more benevolent, less possessive. And all these things can be done over time. It doesn't have to be rushed, but it can be the focus of meditation and self-study. And furthermore, as a trustee, we can also be a trustee of our own vestures. In this case, it's mentioned the art of silence, that we can actually guard our speech. and yet extend the good. Sometimes by being silent and just saying the right thing at the right time in a tonality that's uplifting could really extend the good. Whereas if you have compulsive speech, then people will start hearing your compulsive speech rather than your heart. And so it's really important then to begin to develop the art of silence in relation to speech and to try to shift that ratio. We also would want to extend our trust on behalf of others. And that's also comes under the rubric of going slow, as Mr. Judge would suggest, but holding fast. And trust, if necessary, verify, but continue to move in a certain kind of higher mental posture. We can also begin to shift different things in our lifestyle, how we view property. So property is something that we occupy, we use, we share with other people. It's wonderful. It's circular, it's energetic, can be energetic, but it doesn't have to be separative. And even if legally you have to make it separative because of this, that, and the other, doesn't mean you have to act that way in many cases. So one can really take a look at how one treats property, not only as a sacred good in that sense for yourself, but also sacred on behalf of the community. We can also take a look at how we use our money. And this means balancing the old checkbook, which the student still thinks he can do intuitively, but but it doesn't always work. So it's really important actually to really put the nose to the grindstone and get into a regular rhythm about how we use money. This is the initiatory cycle of trusteeship, is starting with ourselves. The same could be said as the way we use time, especially what we call leisure time. It's okay to take a look at the news. It might be okay to relax with television or media. Obviously, the images are not the best these days, but certainly better choices in terms of upholding and manifesting the divine in our action can be used by joining others, as we do here, in thinking through things and meditating on things of a higher nature, of a nature that's more unified and more unifying of human beings and sentient creatures. And finally, how do we use our skills? And of course, people sort of understand this. Let's all get out and fix up the house, or let's all get out there and clean up the yard and things like that. But many people have skills that we may not be aware that they have, and they might want to help us. And even if we might even pay for them, who knows? It might be of real benefit to their families. So looking at property, money, time, leisure, and skills are 4 very practical ways of trying to really make us into a trustee. And in summary then, to the extent to which we can become more conscious of the greater good and being responsible for the greater good, not totally responsible for everything, but at least what's in our orbit, then we can begin to put into practice actions which can actually, on behalf of uplifting each and all. And this in itself will help us possibly transmute our own appropriating tendencies. So thank you very much for listening, and we're ready for questions or additional commentary or examples from other people who certainly know Gandhi and have many anecdotes. Thank you.
Thank you, Marie, so much. It was so wonderful. Thank you for pointing out the HPV connection also. And it occurs to me that the key to theosophy, in at least to me, I've seen it for quite a while now as an extension of the Great Master's letter. And in that letter, he talks about the real need to actually, in our theosophical pursuits, to get rid of the ego. And this, instead of trying to get rid of something here, what you're putting forth here and what Gandhi put forth seems to be an active program, really, that one could implement in one's life, where one is acting on behalf of the whole. And it seems like it opens up a lot of creative avenues for altruism. I was wondering if you could comment on that.
Yes. I would hope someone who has good writing skills but is true to the ideas could actually publish a popular book on this.
Yeah.
Because there is a little bit of despair now about what we can do or what we can't do or what's coming or this or that. But most people are not aware of trusteeship other than being a trustee in a will or something,
Right.
something mechanical.
Sure. Yeah.
But as you point out, Jonathan, this is really a very active mode of doing what we're asked to do in the Bhagavad Gita and other spiritual texts, which is to actually begin to renunciate. And in this case, to renunciate some of our acquisitive things like we need this and we need that. And at the same time, to kind of rebalance our excess so that we're not compulsively talking or we're really more looking and learning and living. And there's quite a joy in this. And if people could really catch on to this, then it's not a balance sheet thing of, oh, I gave $100 to this 501c3 for a tax break kind of thing. But you really, and I don't want to take up next session, which is generosity, but it unleashes joy and it unleashes connectedness rather than separateness. And it does at the same time allow us to really think really hard about what we really need and what we can really give when we're thoughtful and when we really need to.
Very good. Thank you. I was thinking also, just listening to you, about the four golden links: universal unity and causation, human solidarity, karma and reincarnation, that it seems so intertwined with this idea of trusteeship.
Yes. If we really start with that, of course, with unity, it's unity with the whole, and the whole both has especially a vertical access to the divine and a horizontal axis to the spirit of the divine, which is in all sentient beings, nature as well as other people. And I think by using things like ideas like karma and reincarnation, it allows us to sharpen our focus on tendencies, conditions, limits, which then also could expose spaces of opportunity perceptually.
Yeah.
And these spaces of opportunity may not simply be ones that we have formulated, like we're the only ones coming up with this, but in fact allows us to connect with others. And when we can connect with others who are like-minded, we can begin to, as you point out, have a sense of an active program to act on what our soul tells us to do, as HPB says. And in doing so, we have this sense of human solidarity, which is so missing in society because there's more and more paranoia, fear, distrust of others, polarization, and go through the whole list. And in fact, we can do the exact opposite. And while we may not do grandiose things or think we should even do grandiose things, it is really telling that, as Lao Tzu says, great accomplishments are possible with small beginnings.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that if we're really able to proportion ourselves as well as proportion situations and simply live life and live it with a joy and a lovingness, and of course, as we always say, with self-correction from error, but at the same time, in that self-correction, we're also going to see opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
And so we can really look for opportunities in terms of unmet needs of others. And maybe today we may not be able to do anything, but we have a seed thought.
Mm-hmm.
And that seed thought may come up in us or possibly in others later. So we're really building this collection of wholesome, uplifting seed thoughts, some of which we might be able to act on now, and some of which we're not going to be able to act on. But from this, maybe if we reduce the number of desires, as Judge and others point out, and become more single-pointed in concentration and more purified in moving beyond likes and dislikes, moving beyond negative emotions, that we become more single-pointed. And in becoming single-pointed, but at the same time, more open-minded through thinking about how we could be a trustee for the good earth or a trustee for the common good.
Thank you. Well, I imagine people have been just kind of soaking all this in and enjoying you and the sound of your voice. We can open up to the group. Does anyone have any questions or comments that they would like to add or to bring up on this radical idea of trusteeship? Come on, all you radicals out there. I know you're out there.
I just have a quote from Buddha.
Yeah, go for it.
When you do something for somebody else, or in this case a group, when you do something for someone else, do so with no thought of self, so that they forgive you for making life attractive to them.
Yes.
Did you want to add anything more to that, Arun, or that's just a quote, right?
I haven't said anything.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead, Arun. Then, in that case, sorry about that.
It was mentioned a few times, going slow, but something fast. But there's also a concept known as festina lente, which goes back to, I think, Marcus Aurelius, which literally means make haste slowly. And it's probably the best thing I learned from my piano teacher, actually, the concept of festina lente, meaning consciously and slowly. But this was mentioned a few times, so I thought I'd just add that. But look, what a wonderful talk.
Thank you, Arun. Shobha?
Yeah, Maurice, thank you so much. This was so inspiring. I immediately, when you talked about time and money and all that, I remembered something that B.P. Wadia wrote in his book, Living the Life. There's a chapter called Help the Work, and he says, we exist to serve the cause and are responsible for keeping it going as the visible incarnation of the invisible movement. And this can be done by work, wealth, and time. And he says that work which creates for the SELF, self, the lower, is selfish. That which creates for S capital, ELF, is sacrifice. Wealth which preserves the lower self, SELF, causes poverty. That which preserves the higher leads to wisdom. Time which renews the lower begets pain. That which renews the higher is bliss. So I just thought your talk reminded me of BP Wadia's triple. He always uses this triple, three in one to talk about. And thank you so much.
Yes, thank you. That's very, very helpful, because it does raise the question that Gandhi raised about what is true wealth. And during my presentation, I was pretty much thinking of money as wealth, mainly because of trying to breach the rich and poor. But it's so wonderful that you brought that up, because of course, what is real wealth? The real wealth is higher wisdom. So thank you so much for BP Wadia's contribution.
You're welcome.
Maurice, could you kind of go into a little bit more about what you spoke about regeneration? I think at the very outset of your talk.
Yes, it was a quote by Gandhi in a letter, actually. And I'll just read it again because it's 2 or 3 sentences. The art of renunciation of everything is not merely a physical renunciation, but represents a second or new birth. It is a deliberate act, not done in ignorance. It is therefore a regeneration. So when one, this is up for discussion, of course, but it regenerate. When you renunciate, you're kind of letting go of old baggage. It's like we're carrying around this bag of what. It's time to kind of like drop it, or at least lighten the load, so to speak, and literally lighten up. And one lightens up, of course, in the mind, as well as dropping anything physical as well. So really, the renunciation is something where we don't get bogged down by attachments and attachments to results. And when we tend to lighten up and not make everything, every conversation, the most important one we've ever had in our life, so to speak, and so we try to reduce our negative emotions, but then after that, kind of reduce our reliance on too many sensual likes and dislikes beyond just the negative emotions, anger and things like that. And when we do it as a deliberate act, that is not done in ignorance or just facile, but we really, and it is deliberate, meaning we deliberate on it. And it becomes constant and part of our practice of meditation and self-study. If we begin to experience ourselves in a lighter mode, a lighter mental mode. The question, of course, is what do we do with that? Because it's easy just to go then to one, as the first comment was about, we'll forgive you for making everything attractive. So it is a way of creating that space where one can have the higher light of the spirit come through. And in doing so, it dissolves a little bit of constructed identity, as nice as it might be, and allows the light to move us as self-moving creatures, so to speak, but creators, not creatures anymore. So this notion of lessening up and renunciation, when we really, really do it thoroughly, it really is kind of, if not a new identity, because we're in one sense trying to deconstruct an identity of attachments and likes and dislikes and habits. It really frees people up. So it is like a second or new birth. And in that birth is a seed that's in us, the seed of enlightenment, the seed of ideals, the seed of wanting to, in the heart, that move us and motivate us in a whole different quality. So maybe others have some good answers to that too.
Like Desiree, for sure.
Hi, Maurice.
Hi there.
Hi there. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. And I was wondering, just because, and I know you mentioned that certain sociological ideologies cannot be forced on people. It almost has to grow organically,
Yeah.
from the ground up. You plant the seed. And one of the things that I thought about especially in this discussion about Gandhi, he and so many like him, these higher beings, they simply teach through example. And I'm wondering, in what way is just simply setting an example, not pushing it on people, but just merely setting an example, actually help with that dissemination of these high ideals?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And of course, Gandhi has said he didn't want any Gandhiism. But just take a look at what he does. His life is what he does. And I think that's very, very true, that if you're fortunate enough, and we all may have been, to have been in contact with someone that really had a non-ego-centered trusteeship about them, that they looked after the common good, but they did it quietly, they did it through their actions. Of course, they may have suffered. It's not, that easy. I think it's definitely the way in which even children must learn. At some level, children must learn even how their parents could have suffered or how they suffer when they become parents. So there's definitely I think, a quality of suffering in a sense of tapas, where you're kind of burning out some things, and that allows for something new to come in, a new birth. And it's like you said, through example and through realization, not just through intellectual concept, where this really happens. But at the same time, people, for example, are so into property, and my property, your property, and this division, that without using a different kind of word, people might not have the realization to think that there might be another way, although it may not, as you suggest, be real to them until they actually see it. And Gandhi was a long time ago, so they might need to see it in examples today.
One of the, you mentioned property. One of the ideas of property, too, is intellectual property that we hang our egos on.
Yeah.
And I really don't think that anybody owns any kind of idea. Those ideas are in the ether, and they are either attracted to us or not. But I wonder if something can be said also about this concept of intellectual property that people seem to be really attached to. And I'm sure it's primarily ego, but it's can also cause a lot of separateness, I believe, as well, when we think we are producing something that is genuinely ours and ours alone, and it really isn't.
Yeah. Maybe let's try to think back to what John Locke said about property in the first place. There was something maybe kind of good about it because he felt that maybe it was something that came out of one. And so one has some ability to control what something that comes out of one. And it seems to be the same analogy to intellectual property, right? That, well, it came out of me, although most intellectual property has slews of footnotes, which means that you're really saying other people had a lot to do with what I was thinking about in the first place. So you're absolutely, we're all really interdependent. And so the idea of someone's personal intellectual property, it can only go so far if it goes any place. You know, it did come out of you, you worked hard for it. To say that you shouldn't get any credit at all, that doesn't seem very fair either. But at the same time, one doesn't have to be obsessed by the attachment to it. And it's the attachment to it, and then the need to get a remuneration 20 years later for it. That kind of attachment and monetization of it, if not weaponization of it, that's what really causes, I think, what you're indicating in terms of this separateness. So I think it's more of creating and then letting go.
I'm reminded of a saying from Isaac Newton, that the reason he was able to see farther is because he was standing on the shoulders of giants. And so it's a carryover that they've set the foundations, and we're just carrying on with what they started. So he was very much recognizing that what he was doing couldn't have ever happened without those that came before him. I also wanted to talk a little bit about renunciations. I've heard this somewhere, and I can't remember where, but that there's a great abyss between false judgment and true discretion, and it's paved with renunciation the whole way. And it reminded me of what you were saying about rebirth, that this is a constant rebirthing process. When we do renunciate, it almost like widens the lens, the perspective that of what we're able to experience and feel and engage in. So there's definitely this correlation between renunciation and being able to expand that love and that I want to call it feeling of responsibility, but it actually goes beyond that. So yes, renunciation just seems to play such a major role in our ability to connect with others, truly connect with others, not just mechanically, as you mentioned earlier. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I was just reading about, what happens to truth, right? Are we in the post-truth era? And Werner Herzog, who's a filmmaker and has done all kinds of other things too. And it's amazing how much he points out that so much of how we act, even before the computer, so to speak, or even before AI, is mostly done on falsities. World War II was created because someone made a false claim about what happened in Poland. They just made it up, fake news, right? And it goes on, and it stunned me. I was stunned when you mentioned false judgment, it made me pause. Yes, and it's easy to come to conclusions. And facts themselves are not necessarily truth, even though they can be an aid maybe to building truth. But that's all. And so how do you go from false judgment to having this, not just this rebirth, but a sense of truth and nonviolence, right? That's where Gandhi's principles were. And it seems that it is in this being able to hold uncertainty or hold different points of view, and to be able to be the great sifter, as we're told, to continually sift and not come down with one judgment right away or one mechanical thing right away. And that can be painful. It's could be painful, but to zealously guard and maintain that space, even though we may have to act as circumstances we think require, or even though we're rebirthing something new, a new seed in us. So maybe others have some comments about that. How do we deal in the post-truth age with truth and nonviolence? And how renunciation is so important, at least to just hold something for a moment or for a week and see different points of view.
Are you saying, Maurice and Desiree, that when there's renunciation built into a teaching or a truth or a statement, that kind of validates it? It makes it more real. It's a question.
Yeah, I think it does, if in terms of being able to sift it.
The sifting criteria.
That's sifting, because there's a kind of a gravitas to that. And it moves you beyond the superficial, where your heart really has to discriminate different points of view. There may not just be one point of view, actually, but to have the patience to hold fast and sift.
We've got a question in the hall. Yes,
Can you elaborate further in more practical terms what renunciation means?
Can we elaborate further in more practical terms what renunciation means?
No. Okay. No, well, I'll start, and others, of course, can contribute, but renunciation, at least in the way we're discussing it here, is consciously looking at oneself, one's behavior, and the common good, and seeing what seems to be giving life as opposed to not giving life, seems to what's more true than less true, and sift out that which is a little bit more permanent than that which is fleeting or emotional. And so part of this then is the kind of a first stage of renunciation, which is nothing else, just cleaning oneself out, so to speak, of emotion. So one is able then to see clearly. And then when one can see clearly, one can really think through a more major aspect or interconnected sense of what needs to be let go in order to create a greater good. And that's really the key is if one renunciates, how does that allow us to begin to see ourselves in a greater whole or a greater good? You might get others on that.
Good. That's very good. Thank you. Or anyone else want to contribute to an answer to that question? What constitutes renunciation? How does that work?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that one. Say it.
Hello there, Maurice. This is Ken here in the San Diego Lodge. Thank you for that delightful review of that pamphlet. Now I'm anxious to take a look at that one if I can find a copy. And the renunciation idea, has been fascinating to me over these many months and years as looking at the Gita and especially the Voice of the Silence and these theosophical studies. It seems to be that a big part of it has to do with identity. And when you talk about letting go of those personal desires, for a bigger house or a fancy car or a Maserati or something, and maybe to consider things like those legal aspects of statutory trusts, part of the identity idea is like, well, who am I really? And as we look at this renunciation function or this renunciation task, for me, it's really tied into what Blavatsky calls this delusion of separateness. And that as we move on this path, like in the Voice of the Silence, it says, that we want to know that our mind is I'm looking here at the voice, is the thought producer, and the mind is the great slayer of the real, and let the disciples slay the slayer. So in a sense, we want to, in this renunciation process, I think, let go of part of our little s self or little p personality and use it as a vehicle, as a tool to do things in the world, but recognizing that our center of gravity, if you will, is somewhat different than what we might view psychologically as our personality. Does that ring true to you, Maurice?
Yes, it does. I like your idea of center of gravity, because we're really, when we look at identity, the question is, what is our center of gravity? And obviously we're sevenfold beings. So on what plane is our center? Where are we coming from in terms of our center of gravity, if you will? So I think it's really important to look at identity and to keep asking ourselves, who am I? Because as we know, Shankaracharya and others suggest that through meditation and self-study, the I tends to dissolve more. But then, of course, there's a new question of who am I? So we're constantly letting go, but then confronting a different center of gravity, if you want to call it that. So it's a really nice expression, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I've been thinking about something that Professor Iyer said to me maybe a couple of weeks before he passed away, that I've been puzzling over for 30 years. He said that people are going to have to figure out that the real currency is gratitude. And I've been thinking about that. And I still don't know everything about that. But it is true that he would say a lot of things that kind of had to do with the future, to be honest. And it's, I'm thinking that right now, like in the news, there's a lot being talked about with currency and so forth, and the BRICS nations and all that stuff. So we're getting pretty macro here. But, or is it going to be gold? Is it going to be, what's going on? Is it going to be Bitcoin? All that stuff. But underneath it all, when you think about it, every transaction that you do with, at the store or whatever, there's a thank you involved. It's like the fundamental substratum of the whole thing. And I was wondering if you could say anything, kind of in wrapping up, because I know you got to go, about how that might even be perhaps more pronounced in kind of in an economy of trusteeship.
Yeah. Well, an economy of trusteeship is all based on gratitude. Gratitude for what nature has given, and gratitude for having the opportunity to share with other people or be with other people or sentient beings, the earth, in such a way as to make things better. In fact, this is so natural. A lot of people say, I'm glad I was able to join this organization, do something, and make it better after once I leave. So this is a natural aspect of gratitude, of being grateful to the whole. And in particular, I think gratitude is really important because of what the divine has allowed one to manifest. And to have, again, the opportunity to connect the links of love, so to speak, to broaden some sense of a common good. It could be on the material plane, it could be on the level of thought. And I think that's what brings the joy, even though you don't want to get too caught up in it, maybe. But is that it really runs on pure gratitude, because gratitude is inherent in interdependence and unity. And so I think that when it comes to taking a vow or making a commitment to being an active trustee, it's those unmet needs that one can sense in oneself, or if not in others, and that the right being thoughtful is such an opportunity to exercise that gratitude in a way that creates a better whole, a better common good for each and all, and to uplift everyone, uplift their center of gravity, so we say.
Well, thank you very, very much, Maurice. I know that you've got another engagement, and I appreciate you sneaking this one in for us. And it's just very kind and generous, and which in turn is a segue, by the way, to next week. You are all invited to generosity, kind of a nitty-gritty look at the idea of generosity and greed. So, and that in itself is part of a series. The Aquarian series is a series, but within the series, there's lots of little series. And that's taking a look at the 7 deadly sins. But instead of just looking at the sin, we start off with the positive affirmation of generosity. Yeah. And then, okay, fine, we'll look at greed. So, okay, everybody, thank you all for your questions. Thanks for coming very much. And Maurice, above all, thank you so, so much.
So great, Maurice.
Thank you, Maurice.
Yes,
Thank you. Beautiful.
Yeah, well done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Maurice. Thank you, Maurice.
Thank you all for your wonderful comments and for just having this community every week. Thank you.
Namaste.
Namaste.
Be well, everybody.
Namaste.